Welcome, everyone. My name is Tanya Schwartz. I work in JTS's Department of Community Engagement. So pleased to welcome you to Timely Insights, Timeless Wisdom, our spring series where we have the opportunity to feature Best of JTS. And we're so excited today to be welcoming Dr. Sarit Gribetz, JTS Fellow and Associate Professor of Classical Judaism at Fordham University. Our session today is A Queen in the Tomb of the Kings, an ancient monument and its modern legacy. And we're going to hear about Dr. Kattan Gribetz's newest research on a book that she is working on Queen Helena of Adiabene. And it's also terrific timing as being that it's also Women's History Month. If you're feeling inspired by this opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to partner with us by sponsoring a learning session. We offer 3 sponsorship levels: Chacham at $540, Sadiq at $1,000, and Navi at $1,800. We'll post a link in the chat as well to learn more. You can also visit the series registration page. Rabbi Andelman regrets that she had a conflict and is not able to be here today. But we're pleased to have Ellie Gettinger joining us, and we'll be moderating today's session. Just to go over the format for our session, Dr. Kattan Gribetz will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we'll also have a Q&A period at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Ellie Gettinger. During the Q&A period, Ellie will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Kattan Gribetz. Since we receive a large number of questions, we ask that you express your question both clearly, in complete sentences, and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with me, with Tanya Schwartz-Herman. We're going to be screen sharing the PowerPoint presentation for today's session. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the material from Dr. Kattan Gribetz's presentation is from her forthcoming book and is original work in progress. So we won't be sharing a link to the PowerPoint, but we will be sharing it on screen. We will be sharing in the chat a listing of some of the materials that are cited in the PowerPoint for those that wish to learn more about Queen Helena of Adiabene. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Sarit Kattan Gribetz is a JTS Fellow and Associate Professor of Classical Judaism in the Theology Department at Fordham University, as well as the co-director of Fordham Center for Jewish Studies. Her first book, Time and Difference in Rabbinic Judaism, received the National Jewish Book Award in Scholarship. She is currently writing a book about Queen Helena of Adiabene, the subject of today's seminar, and researching the gendered history of Jerusalem. So pleased to turn it over to Dr. Kattan Gribetz.
Good afternoon. As always, I'm really happy to be here, and I want to begin by thanking Tani and Ellie and everyone who works on screen and also behind the scenes to make these online learning opportunities possible. And I'm also thrilled to see so many familiar faces on Zoom, so I'm saying a hello to everybody. Today, I'll be sharing some of my ongoing research about the first century Queen Helena of Adiabene and her tomb located just north of Jerusalem's Old City. I would welcome questions and suggestions and anything that will help me to sharpen and nuance the arguments that I'm trying to make and the story that I'm trying to tell. So please really do send your questions via chat, and I'll do my best to engage them throughout the talk as well as thereafter. On a sunny morning in the fall of 2021, I set out to pay homage to Queen Helena of Adiabene. After coffee at the American Colony Hotel, I turned from Nablus Street onto Salahaddin Street and arrived at a wrought iron gate with the words République Française, Tombe des Rois, French Republic, Tomb of the Kings, emblazoned overhead. This was not my first time trying to visit Helena's tomb. A few years earlier, I made a similar trek in the sweltering August heat, only to discover the gate-locked, tall stone walls obscuring what lay behind them. The French government, which currently owns and controls the site, had closed it to the public for some time, much to the chagrin of archaeologists, locals, and tourists. What used to be an ornate memorial tomb, visible from the road as pilgrims entered into and departed from Jerusalem, is now a site protected and concealed behind tall barriers and suspicious guards. In 2019, after a decade during which almost no one was permitted to tour the burial monument, the French government reluctantly began allowing visitors. In contemporary Jerusalem, the tomb sits in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, one of the most contentious parts of the city, across the street from St. George's Anglican Cathedral and Pilgrim Guest House, and not far from the district court. From the tomb's courtyard, one can see the back of the Hakawati, home to the Palestinian National Theater. As soon as I stepped through the gate, leaving behind the tension of the neighborhood outside, I found myself in an oasis of calm. Even after a hot summer, the site was filled with blooming succulents and other native plants. But what immediately caught my eye was the enormous set of 24 ancient stairs that led down to a plaza with a number of cave-like pools of water. From there, I passed through an impressive arch on the left to an even larger open space where before me stood an extraordinary rectangular edifice cut into the bedrock. The first modern European archaeological excavation in Jerusalem was undertaken at this site in 1863, though the saga of unearthing the tomb's contents began over a decade earlier in the early 1850s, and debate about its archaeological features unfolded earlier still. In the mid-20th century, the tomb became the subject of the first doctoral dissertation in the Hebrew University's Department of Archaeology. Of particular interest in that dissertation was the tomb's rolling stone, which sealed the entrance to the subterranean burial niches with the same basic technology as that detailed in the New Testament Gospels about Jesus's tomb. In 2010, the 19th century excavation took center stage again when the Israel Museum featured one of the tomb's sarcophagi in a special exhibit marking the museum's renovation and the inauguration of its archaeology wing. Since then, there have been further excavations at the site and renewed archaeological interest. In other words, the tomb played a central role in the initiation of archaeological endeavors in 19th century Jerusalem, the study of archaeology as an academic discipline in the university in the 20th century, and the continued exhibition and display of archaeological finds in contemporary Jerusalem in the 21st century. At the time of the initial excavation and still today, the site was commonly called the Tomb of the Kings. Starting in the medieval period, it acquired this name alongside its more ancient one, Helena's Mausoleum. Today, most archaeologists and historians believe that the tomb probably belonged to Queen Helena of Adiabene and her royal family, though some assumed and some adamantly insisted that it housed the bones of biblical monarchs. Disagreement about the identity of the place and the people buried inside was not incidental to the site's excavations. The question of the tomb's identity was the primary reason for the excavation. For at least half a century before, visitors to the city debated the antiquity of the site. The stakes of the debate were high for those engaged in these discussions, not least because they believed the veracity of the Bible and their own status as discoverers of the biblical past to hang in the balance. I did not end up at Helena's Mausoleum by accident. I'm currently writing a book about this first century queen and her long legacy through the medieval and modern periods. I began with written sources and the oral traditions they incorporate. But I wanted to understand the diverse paths through which her story has been transmitted. And through the texts, I came to realize that Helena's story was transmitted not only textually, but also materially. geography, topography, the placement of monumental buildings, mundane urban features such as street names and street signs, embodied practices of the everyday, and more, all play a role in narrating ancient history and preserving memory, even of a distant past. And so I set out to explore, wondering what I could discover if I followed the multiple paths of this queen's story wherever they led me. My research about Helena and her afterlife has now taken me to archaeological excavations, including Helena's mausoleum, along with municipal and state archives, rare book rooms, museums, folklore experts, governmental offices, embassies and consulates, the Census Bureau, photography collections, and postcard repositories, and to the streets of the city. As a scholar who spends most of my time in the labyrinths of libraries and online databases reading ancient texts, these new spaces of inquiry have given me a deep appreciation for the tight knots that bind the ancient past with the centuries that followed and with our own contemporary contexts. And they have illuminated for me the centrality of space, the local and the distant, the inaccessible and the contested in this story, and how communities and the stories they tell transform across vast chronological, geographical, linguistic, and religious expanses. And so in my presentation today, I'd like to focus on the history of the queen in the Tomb of the Kings. Before turning to the history of this tomb, though, allow me to say a word about Queen Helena. According to the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, Helena was a queen of the Parthian client kingdom of Adiabene in today's Iraqi Kurdistan. In the mid-40s CE, as a widow, she traveled from northern Mesopotamia to Jerusalem because of her devotion to the Jewish God and her wish to worship in the temple. She stayed because she fell in love with the city and with its people. Helena became a beloved patron of the city, feeding its residents during famine and erecting monumental buildings, including a palace and a mausoleum. She eventually found her way back to Adiabene, where she died, but her son returned her remains to Jerusalem so that she could be buried near the holy city. Her story, as Josephus tells it, is one of travel between East and West and traversing spatial and confessional boundaries. Her story is also about the endurance of her memory in a city in which she commissioned physical structures that prompted her story to be told and retold for centuries. Josephus, who grew up in Jerusalem in the final decade or two of Queen Helena's life, refers a number of times to Helena's buildings in his early writings. They serve as recognizable landmarks when he writes about his hometown. So here you see on the screen, he describes how the flames of Jerusalem's destruction in the late 60s CE reached as far as Helena's palace south of the city, and that the Jewish rebels pursued the Roman forces all the way to Helena's tomb to the north. In his later work, Josephus tells Helena's story of conversion, pilgrimage, and patronage. Josephus might have met the queen or some of her descendants either in Jerusalem, where he spent his early years, or in Rome, where he wrote his works. Regardless, he knew her buildings. Late ancient rabbinic and patristic texts, including the Mishnah, Tosefta, the Babylonian Talmud, as well as the writings of Eusebius, Jerome, and Paulus Orosius, tell Helena's story each in their own way and for distinct ends. And while these traditions remained relatively segregated in late antiquity, their paths merged in surprisingly dramatic form in the medieval period, in particular in Jewish Christian polemics, including the Toldot Yeshu traditions, disputation, accounts, biblical and Talmudic commentaries, and the writings of bishops and friars. And some of these manuscripts are also housed at JTS's collection, and I've come to see them, and they're really beautiful. In these sources, Helena stars as Queen of Jerusalem and the region of Judea, a position she never actually held and that no earlier sources bestow upon her. In the modern period, Helena re-emerged as a central figure in Jewish historiography and popular literature, especially in works that grappled with the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, Christian missionizing, debates about Jewish emancipation, a burgeoning women's movement, and rising anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in Europe. Today, a street in Jerusalem, Rehov Heleni HaMelka, bears this queen's name. The street itself has a fascinating history, but that's a topic for another day. Helena's tomb is central to her long legacy from antiquity to the present, not least because, as I contend in my book, it played an important role in transmitting traditions about her to passersby for millennia. The tomb, in other words, was an active, agentive force in the perpetuation of memory. So the tomb was really an actor in this story. My talk, or at least the rest of my talk, is divided into several parts. The first traces the tomb's appearance prior to its excavation in the mid-19th century by analyzing medieval travel accounts, early modern maps, and descriptions of the tomb, alongside contemporary paintings, illustrations, and engravings. These sources highlight that Helena remains associated with the tomb throughout these centuries. The second part turns to de Saulcy's explorations in the 1850s and 1860s, including his archaeological discoveries, early photographs he commissioned, and debates that he instigated about the tomb's identity. The third part of the tomb focuses on the place of the tomb in the city among residents and visitors from the end of the 19th century through the first decades of the 20th century, and the role of new technologies and media, including photography, postcards, and stereoscopes, in how people engaged with the tomb. For the sake of time, I won't discuss the story of the tomb's ownership in the 1870s and 80s and later controversies about it, nor about more recent archaeological research about the tomb, which tends especially to understanding the tomb's architectural features and recontextualizes the site within first century Jerusalem. And in my conclusion, I'll address the tomb's complicated place in the history of Jerusalem. And each of these parts highlights Helena's relationship with the tomb and the tomb's role in transmitting traditions about Helena. Throughout late antiquity, the elaborate tomb structure north of the city walls was revered as Helena's tomb. In medieval and early modern periods, the tomb's association with Helena never disappeared, but the structure also became associated with biblical monarchs and called by many the Tomb of the Kings. Textual and cartographic sources point to an interesting fact. While the site of the tomb was known as both Helena's tomb and the Tomb of the Kings, in most cases, the latter identification supplemented rather than replaced the former. So Tomb of the Kings was added rather than replaced Helena's tomb. But the two names for the site were not necessarily used entirely interchangeably. When texts or maps describe ancient Jerusalem, they usually refer to or label the tomb after Helena, whereas when they represent Jerusalem in their own times, they often associate the tomb with kings. Likewise, those who describe the area of Jerusalem in writing or illustrate it visually from afar outside of the city, without necessarily having ever visited the city, are more likely to associate the tomb with Helena as they base their knowledge on written sources. Those who produce their works as a result of visits to the city, in contrast, more consistently call it the Tomb of the Kings. Relatedly, imagined visual renderings of the city, most notably in imaginary maps, depict the tomb as a monumental structure with pyramids, while more realistic maps that capture Jerusalem as it stood during the period when the map was drawn depict it as a simpler square below or above ground, and even sometimes as an ancient ruin in a hilly landscape. The ancient and contemporary mappings of Jerusalem's landscape thus create two parallel traditions in the city in which the same monument was simultaneously associated in various contexts with an ancient queen as well as with biblical kings. In the first decades of the 14th century, for example, the Venetian Marino Sanudo Torcello, in a work of crusading propaganda titled Secreta Fidelium Crucis, identifies the structure as the Sepulchro Reginae Iabenorum, the tomb of the Queen of Adiabene. In the same period, Rabbi Isaac ben Yosef Ibn Chelo, a Spanish Jew who moved to the land of Israel, sent a letter to his father recording remarkable tombs in the region, noting that, quote, when one leaves the city via the Gate of Abraham, which refers to the Damascus Gate, one enters the tomb of the kings. This letter, dated 1333 to 1334, is the earliest source known to me that uses this name for the tomb. Maps tell a similarly complex story. The monumental tomb remained an important part of how many cartographers visualized the cityscape, whether they depicted the city in the ancient past or in their own days. Imaginary maps that visualize the city's ancient history, take for instance Christian van Adricham's 1584 map of Jerusalem, usually associate the tomb with Helena and her family. This map depicts Helena's tomb with 3 pyramids, and it marks it Mausoleum Helena Regina. Because such maps are based on biblical and other ancient sources, Josephus most prominent among them, they follow Josephus's description of the tomb, its architectural features, and its location. In Adricham's map, Helena's mausoleum stands adjacent to a depiction of Alexander the Great's visit with the high priest in Jerusalem, an encounter also found in Josephus. The map also includes images, for example, of Bathsheba bathing in her courtyard adjacent to David's palace, the priest Zadok anointing Solomon, the high priest serving in the temple, Jesus entering the city along with his crucifixion. And in doing so, it conflates all of biblical history onto a single cartographic image. And here are a few additional images of imaginary maps that include Helena's mausoleum. So here you see it with 3 but not identical pyramids on the top, and on the bottom, a comparison with the way that the same map describes or depicts Herod's tomb. And this one writes the name of the tomb in German. Here is another example of a map that depicts the tomb with 5 pyramids and sort of an elaborate courtyard type structure with a fence around it. And here we have another one which is a little more ambiguous. In contrast, we notice more variability in pilgrimage and other maps that produce contemporary renderings of the city. While some of them associate Helena with the tomb, many of them identify it as the tomb of the kings, or in this case, the tomb of the 3 kings. So here are a few examples of those. Here we have one with a European-style clock tower. Around 1640, Francisco Quares Meus, a Franciscan friar who had served as custodian of the holy places in Jerusalem, included a map of the city in his book on the Holy Land, which he hoped would be used by pilgrims and Franciscan guides. He too includes the tomb, labeling it Sepulchra Regia, royal tomb, though in his illustration, the tomb is presented as a square courtyard, as it probably stood in his day and as it stands today, rather than as a monumental tomb adorned with 3 large pyramids, as Josephus describes and Adricham draws. As early as 1661, a map of Jerusalem found in Electus Spinner's Blumenbuch des Heiligen Lands Palästina labels the site Die Gräber der Königin. And an English map, which you see here on the PowerPoint, dated to 1757, uses the phrase the sepulchres of the kings, while others use Arabic versions of the name, including Kubur el-Muluk and Kubur es-Salatin. This 18th century, this is the map that I was referring to. And now this 18th century map from Paris labels the site Tombe des Rois, as it is still labeled on the gate to the site today, And as you can see right here on the top left, it contains a little floor plan with the underground chambers of the tomb depicted. And these just represent a small sampling of dozens of maps. Between the 16th and early 19th century, dozens of European travelers to Jerusalem devoted considerable thought to understanding the archaeological ruins. The Lithuanian prince, Christophe Radziwill, and Lord Jacques de Viamont from Brittany both visited Jerusalem towards the end of the 16th century, and they independently identify the tomb as belonging to the kings of Judah or Jerusalem, with no mention of Helena. On March 28, 1697, Henry Mondrel, an Oxford-trained academic who was at the time living in Aleppo as chaplain to the British Levant Company, made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It was Easter Sunday when he visited, quote, those famous grots called the Sepulchres of the Kings. Quote, for what reason they go by that name is hard to resolve, Mondrel admits in his travel narrative, for it is certain none of the kings, either of Israel or Judah, were buried there, the Holy Scriptures assigning other places for their sepulchres. A century after Mondrel's visit, François-René de Chateaubriand discussed the Tomb of the Kings in his 1811 travelogue, Itinéraire de Paris à Jérusalem. Chateaubriand headed east when, not long after Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, the Russian Empress Elizabeth Alexeyevna, also known as Princess Louise of Baden, or Louise of Baden, gifted him a large sum of money. When Chateaubriand describes the area of Jerusalem, he turns his attention not to the bustling daily life of the town and its inhabitants, but to its hilly landscape, strewn with monumental tombs and other remnants of the past, approaching his account with the attention of a painter, which he was. After describing the tomb in exquisite detail, Chateaubriand tries to determine which kings might have been buried inside. He harnesses biblical passages to demonstrate that the tomb did not house the remains of David and Solomon, for scripture places David's tomb within the city. But then he debates whether the tomb represented that of the Maccabees, Queen Helena's tomb, or the tomb of Herod, based on his reading of Josephus. Among dozens of recorded visitors were the Montefiores, who stopped by the tomb on June 11, 1839, and the American archaeologist Edward Robinson, who visited in 1838, and together with Eli Smith, published an archaeological analysis of the site, arguing that it belonged to Helena of Adiabene, the first to make the case in such a way that it became widely accepted by early archaeologists. People had made the argument earlier, but it wasn't as accepted. We encounter in engravings and paintings of this period visual depictions of the Tomb of the Kings as it stood in the 19th century when these travelers came to visit. Here, a series of paintings attributed to Luigi Meyer, published in 1804, shows bustling scenes of crowds gathering, men entering the burial chambers, examination of doors and sarcophagi, and eventually a sarcophagus lid hoisted out of the tomb court with ropes and other contraptions. The German rabbi Ludwig Philippson included one of Meyer's images of the tomb in his side-by-side Hebrew-German edition of the Bible, published between 1839 and 1854. Other images were created by the French painter and curator of the Louvre, Louis-Auguste de Faubrine, as well as the French painter and sculptor Louis-François Cassin, the English engraver William Finden, and the Scottish painter David Roberts. These works, many of which drew upon popular Orientalist tropes of the mid-19th century, present the place as simultaneously an ancient ruin and a contemporary site of meeting, community, rest, business, and leisure. It was an old site, but by no means abandoned or forgotten. I'm going to pause here to answer any questions before moving on to the story of the archaeological dig itself. Ellie, I can't hear you.
You're right, because I'm muted. If you can stop sharing for this, just so we can, amazing. Thank you so much. As we discussed before, a lot of people have the question of, why have I never heard of this person? How did you hear about her? And then we'll get it. So let's start with that. Why have most of us never heard of her? And how did you hear about her? And then also, was it so widely known in Josephus? Because it is kind of impressive that all of these scholars from the Middle Ages up through, kind of early Enlightenment into the 19th century are kind of familiar with Helena enough so that they're identifying her tomb and giving her kind of historic credence.
It's a great question. So the question of why have not more of you heard about Helena of Adiabene is really a question that I ask in my research and that I'm trying to answer both in this book, but also especially in the other book that I'm writing, which is called Jerusalem: A Feminist History. And my first assumption when I started writing this book, and I'll explain how I came to do so in a minute, was that Helena was popular and important in antiquity, and then sometime in the Middle Ages, people forgot about her. And as I started finding sources and maps and all sorts of sources to tell the story, I realized that I was wrong, that actually Helena wasn't forgotten. She was actually quite well known throughout these periods. And the question really became, why is she not known today as much, rather than why was she forgotten a long time ago? And that's a story that's really about how the modern study of history has developed more than necessarily a story about how ancient or medieval histories were told and retold. And part of the question that I have in this book is really, how do traditions get transmitted? How do they get forgotten? How are they preserved? But also, how are they deliberately sometimes obscured or resurrected in the way that we think about the past? So that's sort of a general comment about why not more people have heard about her. Oftentimes, the only reason why people know about Helena of Adiabene is because they have walked on the street in Jerusalem called Rehov Heleni Hamelka. And so that also got me interested in, wow, how can a street name be so influential in sort of perpetuating the memory of a particular figure? But I learned about Helena of Adiabene many years ago in a class in the Hebrew University that was taught by Danny Schwartz, and we had a substitute teacher, Isaiah Goffney, who came, and we were reading book 20 of Josephus's Antiquities, which is the last book, and it's a book that Professor Schwartz has been translating and working on for many years, and Helena of Adiabene takes up a good portion of that last book. And we read the account together, and it's a fascinating account, and it's in the list of resources that anyone who's interested can read more about it. But one of the questions that hasn't yet been sort of expanded upon or satisfyingly answered is, why was she so important to Josephus, right? Why end his history in such a way that really puts her into the middle of the story? So that's how I got to know her. And then this is a classic story of a footnote becoming a book. Because I teach a class on Jerusalem, on the history of Jerusalem, and every semester I've been surprised by how much paying attention to the gendered history of Jerusalem helps us tell a very different story about Jerusalem's history. And so I decided to write that book and to include a paragraph about Heleni Hamelka in that book. And through a series of events, that paragraph became what is now a very long book.
Grew. Yeah. There's several questions about her biography as well. If you could expand on, first of all, where her title is from, and then also how she came to Judaism and Jerusalem.
Yeah, so I'll answer that question in brief. to say that we don't really know anything about the historical Helena of Adiabene. The first source that we have is Josephus, and Josephus writes his account of her life many decades after her death. Josephus writes in Rome after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. She lived in Jerusalem sort of in the later 40s and 50s CE. So we're talking, if someone were to write a story about someone who lived 20, 30, 40 years ago, scholars of Josephus are pretty certain that Josephus is not making the story up on his own, but he's using sources, probably more than one source. And we don't really have access to what those sources are, but he was probably using sources that might have originally come from Adiabene, or were written about, maybe royal accounts, and so on. There are also sections that he writes that I think he probably wrote on his own, rather than just sort of inheriting. And those are the sources that relate specifically to her time in Jerusalem. So he talks about that. So in terms of sort of what we know about her is really filtered through the lens of Josephus. We have other ancient sources that come after Josephus. So Pausanias, for example, describes visiting her tomb and sort of recommends in his book that other travelers come and see this beautiful tomb. A lot of the early Christian sources rely on Josephus, so they don't help us much in getting further in terms of the historicity of what is known. And rabbinic sources, especially early rabbinic sources, tell stories about Helena that are very different from Josephus, sort of like in tone, they're very similar, but they don't know most of what Josephus says, but they do know a lot of other stories about Helen. For example, she was a Nazarite. She built an enormous sukkah. She donated golden objects to the temple. And so that's not to say that she did or didn't do those things, but already by the time that the Mishnah and the Tosefta are compiled in the early 3rd century, there are traditions in Roman Galilee and other places that rabbis are working that already remember Helen in those ways. The story that Josephus tells is one about the birth of her son Izates, who becomes her favorite son, the death of her husband, the rule of Izates in Adiabene, and also the story of the dual conversion of both Helen and her son. Both of them come to be attracted to Judaism from different teachers of Judaism in the Eastern Mediterranean. And they both independently decide to convert to Judaism. One favors the position that you must be circumcised. So Izates, Helena's son, really subscribes to the kind of Judaism in which circumcision is necessary. And Helena, his mother, is very anxious about the implications of circumcision. She tries to convince her son that that's a bad idea. And part of Josephus's story is really about this debate and the decision eventually to be circumcised, and Helen of Adiabene sort of coming around to understanding that that's sort of proper practice. And then when Helena sees that everything is going well in Adiabene, she says, okay, now it's time for me to go worship in the temple. And she leaves her homeland, and Izates, her son, sort of accompanies her part of the way. He escorts her, and then she comes all the way to Jerusalem. And Josephus describes that when she arrives in Jerusalem, it is the time of the famine during the rule of Claudius, and the people of Jerusalem don't have enough to eat. And so she uses her financial resources and her connections to get grain and figs from Egypt and Cyprus to feed the people. And that's the part of the tradition that early Christian sources latch onto in Josephus. So when Christian pilgrims passed Helen's tomb, the sources suggest that what they told of Helen's story is, oh, That's where Queen Helen is buried. She's the one who came to Jerusalem as a convert to what gets debated, whether it's Judaism or Christianity, but she's a convert who generously fed the people of the city at a time of need. And so she sort of becomes this example of charity to the poor and also sort of philanthropy in the city.
So there are many more questions, but I also know you have much more to go. So let's keep going and we'll get to some of these other questions as we keep going. Thank you.
So I'm going to screen share again. Can everyone see the PowerPoint again? Okay, great. So now we're going to turn to the archaeological explorations of the mid-19th century. The French archaeologist Félicien de Saussure arrived in Jerusalem in 1851. His position about the identity of the tomb stands in contrast to many of his predecessors that we just talked about before the Q&A. He was adamant from the very first trip he took to the tomb that it housed the remains not of Queen Helena, but of King David and several generations of his royal family. De Saussure notes in a single breath his admiration for the tomb and his desire to plunder its contents and ship them off to Paris. And here is a quote. "Up to the present time, this is the object we have most admired of all we have seen, having discovered in it 3 stone lids of sarcophagi, which would be invaluable in such a museum as that of the Louvre. Henceforth, we are continually revolving in our minds the means by which we may obtain possession of and carry off these precious remains of Judaic art." In his analysis of the tomb over the course of 75 very detailed pages, de Saussure insists that the tomb of the kings housed Davidic kings. He writes, quote, "I hope to demonstrate, while discussing every particular connected with the monument known under the name of the Tomb of the Kings, that in this particular instance, tradition is to be fully depended on, and that this is really the place where the kings of Judah were interred." So he says, sometimes we can't trust ancient traditions and oral traditions, but in this case, it's called the Tomb of the Kings, and we have to trust that. It would be difficult to explain, he adds, why Queen Helena, when she was preparing a funeral cave for her son and for herself, she would have conceived the strange idea of ordering 20 tombs instead of 2, 18 more than were necessary. Upon his return to Paris, he lectured about his findings, some of which he brought back with him and actually did display at the Louvre. De Saussure's voyage became the talk of the town, both in Paris and the international academic community. Many of de Saussure's colleagues, including Désiré Raoul Rochet and eventually also Ernst Renan, doubted his conclusions. In December 1853, France's Ministry of Public Instruction arranged for the Alsatian painter and photographer Auguste Salzmann to document the tomb and provide evidence to ground de Saussure's claims. Salzmann's assignment was in part scientific, documentary, artistic, and political. In the book of photographs he published from his trip, amongst our earliest photographs of Jerusalem and the very first of this tomb, he characterizes his photographic work as, quote, "doing a real service to science." Many decades later, in the 1970s, the French theorist Roland Barthes remarked about one of Salzmann's images. In 1850, quote, "Salzmann photographed near Jerusalem the road to Bethlehem. Nothing but stony ground, olive trees, but 3 tenses dizzy my consciousness, my present, the time of Jesus, and that of the photographer, all this under the instance of reality, and no longer through the elaborations of the text, whether visual or poetic, which itself is never credible down to the root." So he writes this about one of Salzmann's other images from the trip, but I think it captures a little bit of the sentiment of these photographs as well. Salzmann reasoned that depicting the tomb through a camera's lens might convince de Saussure's critics that the tomb of the kings did indeed belong to the biblical era and to the Davidic kings in particular. Until the mid-19th century, the tomb had been marked and depicted on maps, illustrated in drawings and paintings, sketched out in archaeological reconstructions, and described in vivid detail in travelogues and geographical surveys. Now, photography offered a new medium, at first an art form and soon also a commercial tool, because these photographs were sold, that could capture the landscape, serve as eyewitnesses, and bring the Holy Land and its ruins to those far away. Photographing the site also constituted forms of possession and appropriation, goals articulated by de Saussure from the very moment he lay eyes on the tomb. Salzman's photographs did little to convince de Saussure's critics, however. In fact, photographs of the Greco-Roman decorative features of the tomb, its sarcophagus, and its doors simply reinforced the view that the tomb's view of the tomb's relatively late date. Right? Like anyone looking at this realized that it wasn't a biblical tomb, but an early Roman one. A decade later, de Saussure returned to Jerusalem, purportedly with an Ottoman firman from Sultan Abdulaziz in Istanbul, authorizing an official archaeological excavation. De Saussure records his excavation in great detail in his 1865 Voyage en Terre Sainte, but for the sake of time, I won't recount the whole story here. Most importantly for our story is that de Saussure's team discovered a sarcophagus with an inscription of a queen on it. And in time, de Saussure admitted, as his colleagues had long urged him to, that the tomb must not belong to the Davidic line after all, at least not the earliest generations of it. He did, however, manage to perturb the local Jewish community, who were shaken by the disrespect of the human remains that had been thoughtlessly thrown about in the course of the excavation, and because it had been a place for prayer and ritual, known to many of them as the tomb of the first century philanthropist Kalba Savua, as well as the tomb's Muslim landlords, whom de Saussure disrespected throughout the excavation and with whom he did not share the profits of his discoveries. He also drew the ire of colleagues such as the German architect and missionary Conrad Schick and the British archaeologist Sir Charles Warren, both in Jerusalem, and he ultimately absconded with the sarcophagus as well as many other important finds from the tomb, which are now on display in room 181 of the Louvre. The excavation put a temporary stop to further archaeological endeavors in the city's tomb sites. While the Tomb of the Kings was frequented by travelers and locals for centuries, it became a proper tourist attraction in the first decades of the 19th century. Wilson's Ordnance Survey of 1865 put the site prominently on the map. Following de Saussure's excavations and its purchase by a wealthy Jewish family in France, and eventually their handing it over to the French government, the site was cleared of debris, making it more conducive to casual visitors who arrived eager to be awed by the magnificence of the ancient site without necessarily crawling through small passageways to access the tomb's underground chambers. Tour agencies and the travel books they issued provided itineraries and other practical information for getting there. And a growing local photography industry captured images of those visits, allowing travelers to show off their adventures to friends back home, as well as with the media. Despite archaeological consensus that the tomb belonged to Helena of Adiabene, the metal plaque that hung from the tomb, as well as many maps used by visitors, nevertheless referred to it as the Tomb of the Kings. This name no doubt played a role in the popularity of the site among pilgrims, tourists, and visiting dignitaries. Among those that the tomb attracted were modern-day rulers, including Kaiser Wilhelm II and Empress Augusta Victoria, as well as those who dreamt of statehood, such as the founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl. All three arrived within days of one another in 1898. Other important visitors, such as the Montefiores and Mark Twain, described their visits to the tomb in their diaries. Grace Anna and Bertha Spafford posed with over 100 other members of the American colony for an official portrait at the tomb. The American Colonary, a millenarian community made up of Americans from Chicago and Swedes from Nass, had recently moved to a villa next door to the tomb, and they were famous for hosting large swaths of Jerusalem's diverse communities, as well as visitors from around the world. Because one of their primary sources of income was their photography department, the site was photographed frequently. The Oxford-trained writer, traveler, and archaeologist, Gertrude Bell, an Arabist, visited in December 1899. Bell writes in her diary on the day after Christmas that she spent the morning working on her Arabic, as she always did, before heading to the tombs of the kings, which she calls Kubur el-Malakin, with a colleague. She calls them, quote, curious and interesting caves, supposed to be the tomb of the Queen of Adiabene, Helena, 1st century before or after Christ. I found Narcissus nearly out on the walls. Around the same time, the Swedish writer Selma Lagerlöf, together with her romantic partner and travel companion Sophie Elkin, spent some time at the American colony as well. The tomb also became a regular stop on organized tours of Jerusalem, which had become a thriving international industry with headquarters at the Jaffa Gate. Here is a page from Thomas Cook and Sons Travel Guide. And here is a photo of a map printed by the American colony and sold at their store, Vester & Co., at the entrance to the city. The tomb's picture-perfect quality made it especially attractive for those who wished to be photographed, sort of like an Instagram background. Evidence of visits to the site were mailed via postcards around the world and included in travel journals, albums, and scrapbooks. Postcards, a relatively new medium that had only recently started including photographs, the first of which was actually from the Eiffel Tower, sold particularly well. Quote, the place for superstitious people, just as it was 5,000 years ago. But I was kind of shaky about going in. Written in neat cursive handwriting, these words appear on one side of an undated postcard. The other side depicts a hand-colored photograph of the tomb of the kings. The message presents the tomb as a mysterious site. It also insists on the site's antiquity, dating it even further back than the biblical era, while simultaneously noting its unchanged appearance at the time of the author's visit. It stands in this visitor's description, quote, just as it was thousands of years ago, frozen in time, ancient and contemporary at once. The note conveys fear or unease associated with descending into the tomb's dark subterranean burial chambers. A final line at the bottom of the card, written by the same hand, reads, suppose Uncle Sammy did want to shake hands. Wee! So different in substance, this closing remark reminds us that recounting the awe and angst of the visit to the tomb was only part of the message the author wished to share with the recipient. Just as important was the excitement about Uncle Sammy, about whom we know nothing more than that he might have wanted to shake hands, though I really want to know the whole story. The anonymous note provides a glimpse into yet another visit to the Tomb of the Kings, not by a foreign dignitary or renowned scholar, but by a regular tourist or pilgrim to the city. And when such a postcard was mailed, postal workers, recipients, and eventually collectors encountered it along the way. The tomb continued to acquire, through a single postcard, visitors, memories, and traditions of travel and transmission. This postcard of the Tomb of the Kings is one of many produced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, known as the Golden Age of Postcards, and among dozens that I found in the David Perlman Holy Land collection at the Folklore Research Center housed at the Hebrew University. They depicted different scenes and areas of the tomb, including the inner courtyard, the facade, the outer courtyard with its ritual baths, and so on. Some featured the tomb among a collage or assemblage of holy sites, as you see in the middle postcard. Many were unused, but several had intimate handwritten messages that provide a view into the people who visited the tomb or purchased a postcard with an image of it as far as Cairo or Berlin, even if they had never been to Jerusalem. Another popular medium through which images of the tomb circulated in this period were stereoscope cards. Stereoscopes were devices through which a viewer peered at a card that displayed a three-dimensional image. Between 1897 and 1900, for example, Burt and Elmer Underwood produced millions of cards and devices, including 2 sets of Holy Land images, both of which included the Tomb of the Kings with, quote, Syrian girls from the English Protestant school dressed up to play the role of women at Jesus's tomb. Indeed, the tomb's rolling stone was one of the reasons that drew 19th century pilgrims to the site, as it provided a powerful material connection to the Gospels and their accounts of Jesus's burial and resurrection. Here's another card published by Realistic Travels in their Journeys in All Lands series, featuring 2 women holding candles in the, quote, interior of the tombs of the kings on the road to Nablus, with a third figure peering from a more distant part of the tomb. But in the era of photography, it was no longer necessary to travel all the way to Jerusalem. All one needed to do was to peer through a stereoscope, and one was instantly transported not only to the tomb of the kings, but to Jesus's tomb in the 1st century. The postcards and stereoscope photographs that feature this site identify it as the Tomb of the Kings or equivalents in other languages. Almost none mention Queen Helena of Adiabene. The same tourist who might have used Thomas Cook's guide, which identifies the site as both the Tomb of the Kings and Helena's tomb, would then stop at the American Colony store or another tourist shop to pick up a postcard that labeled that same site simply as Tombs of the Kings. That postcard would then be sent to Paris or Rome, and the recipient would have no idea that alternative traditions about the site existed, even if the sender herself might have encountered the site as multivalent or knew that it belonged to the 1st century Queen Helena. As this postcard on the screen shares or describes, tomb of a Kurd convert to Judaism in 100 AD. We might explain the consistency of such postcard and stereoscope captions for this site as a result of general trends in postcard production. The same photographs of the same sites were often printed and reprinted by different companies, and likewise the captions they used were based on previous captions in earlier postcards or photo books, which had also become popular at the time. Postcards and stereoscope photographs thus participate in an iterative and in some ways also self-contained process of transmission. In a broader conversation about transmission of tradition, we see how different genres transmit particular traditions about this tomb. While archaeological scholarship tended more and more to identify the site as Helena's mausoleum, ephemera and other popular commercial materials produced for mass consumption or to promote travel tended in the opposite direction, calling the site Tombs of the Kings. The Tomb of the Kings and Helena's mausoleum were the same place, but used for different ends. I'll pause here again for some questions before turning to my conclusion.
Thanks, Sarit. This is wonderful. So in the tomb itself, there's several rooms. There are 20 people buried there. Can you give us a little bit about the makeup of and what the archaeologists discovered? And in that, there's been some confusion about how did they know that Sadan or Sada meant Queen Helena? What was the indicator that this is her tomb specifically?
Yeah, so those are both great questions. So I'll describe what it is like to visit the tomb today, rather than what it was like to visit the tomb in the middle of the 19th century, when much of it was underground. Today, when one goes to visit the tomb, after entering into the gate, one walks down these 24 monumental stairs. They're uneven, so some of them are wider than others, which was a style because it allowed crowds to be able to use such stairs without sort of tripping over one another. And it was also a way of sort of building fancy stairs. There are similar stairs, I believe, at the Hulda Gate to the Old City, and maybe even possibly how the temple itself is sort of imagined with stairs. When one walks down those stairs, one gets to a small courtyard with 3 archways that lead into pools of water. So directly across from the stairs, there are sort of 2 arches, and behind those arches are mikvaot, ritual baths, and also to the right is another archway with a mikvah. They are sort of carved into the bedrock, and so they're covered, and still today they have water in them from rain. As you walk down those stairs, you see a little water channel that was designed actually to bring water into the mikvaot. So when it rained, the water would sort of be directed into those and fill the mikvaot. Scholars wonder what the role of the mikvaot was in such a tomb, and there are various ways of explaining it. So first of all, cleansing on one for burial rituals and after burial rituals would have been important. And in later periods, there are scholars, for example, Omri Abadi, who has argued that these were ritual baths that people used to purify themselves when they made pilgrimage to Jerusalem. There wasn't enough room in the Old City, or what we call the Old City, for all of these pilgrims. They would camp outside, and then they would purify themselves on their way into the city itself. A scholar named David Gribetz also argues that it might not have only been for ritual purposes, but maybe also for hygienic purposes and for drinking water and all sorts of other matters. And then from that little courtyard, you make a left into another archway, which is bigger, but it has the same style as the mikvaot archways. And once you pass into that, you're in this very, very large courtyard. And the courtyard itself, people who work on the tomb largely agree. So this is everyone from the French archaeologists associated with the École Biblique and with the French conservation archaeologists from the French consulate or archaeologists in university settings, that the site was probably a quarry for stones, and that's how such a big courtyard was carved out of the bedrock, because it sits underneath the ground. So it's possible that it was a quarry before someone decided to make it into a tomb site. And the story of who decided and how that happened is also a separate issue. But when you go into this courtyard, what you'll see today are remains from inside the tomb strewn around. So column capitals and bases, and actually one large door that was probably in the tomb itself, but is sort of shattered into a few pieces that lies on the floor, and so on. And then you see the image that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, which is sort of like an entryway that's carved into the stone. And then if you turn left within that entryway, you see a rolling stone that is placed right like on the floor, leading into an underground burial chamber. And so when I entered that, it's now covered by a grate so that you can't get in without permission, just to both preserve the site, but also because it's quite dangerous to go in there. And the rolling stone is off to one side permanently. That's not how it's closed anymore. But we took a ladder and we climbed down, and it's sort of like you jump down into the underground chamber, and then you enter a vestibule, which is sort of like the foyer of the tomb. And then you can go in a few different directions into rooms that are the burial chambers. And they have little slots, sort of like shelves in a way to put either bodies or ossuaries or sarcophagi, right? So different ways of burying. Some of them also have drain systems so that when you put a body in, the fluids can drain out before they're put into something else. What's interesting about the sarcophagus, and I should say, by the time that we have written records of people going into the tombs, we don't know what the state was in antiquity. So when you look at each of the accounts one by one chronologically, what you notice is over time, people took some of the sarcophagi and other things from within the tomb out of the tomb. How many were taken before we have records of it is really hard to know. But there were several attempts before de Saulcy to do that. De Saulcy even notes in his account, he says like he saw the name of one of his colleagues inscribed in the wall of the burial chamber, and it was like a reunion in the tomb. And so it was also sort of a social experience. And what's interesting, well, there are a couple of things that are interesting. One is that the sarcophagi, many of them have a very similar style. So they either have this very beautiful floral imagery, and then on the other hand, there are tombs that have these like circular images. In 19th century Jewish sources that identify the tomb as the tomb of Kalba Savua, who's a rabbinic figure known for his sort of generous philanthropy in the years leading up to the revolt against Rome. They identify the circles as cakes, like that he gave people like cakes and fruits and vegetables to eat, which I think is very lovely. Some of those sarcophagi are in the Louvre now. 3 of them are throughout Jerusalem. So one is used right now as the step for a fountain on the Haram Sharif. Another is sort of placed outside of the Islamic museum also on the Haram, and a third is part of a fountain on El Wad Street in Jerusalem. I did not collect this information. I found it in a couple of books and articles, but I did go and see them. And I was curious to know how they were so sure that they belonged to the tomb. And as soon as I saw them, I also was very sure, like it's a very particular style. And accounts from this period also talk about the British consulate and a few other places in Jerusalem sort of housing remains from the tomb in their spaces, and whether those still exist or were put elsewhere, I don't know. And what de Saulcy discovered, he might have been the first one. He definitely presents it in that way, and many people think that, and I think there's little reason to totally make a story of this, he probably was, is that he noticed that all the burial rooms have benches around them, sort of like carved out of the rock. In one of them, there's actually a slab. So instead of just being fully cut out of the rock, it was another piece. And his team noticed that and opened it. And then they went in and they found this sarcophagus that had an inscription on it. The inscription, which you saw a picture of, has what seems to be the same or very similar title or name on it in 2 lines in 2 different but similar scripts. There's a long tradition of debating exactly what those scripts are. Are they sort of Proto-Syriac on top, or Palmyran Aramaic, or sort of Mesopotamian, like Eastern Aramaic, and then on the lower part, Aramaic that was more common in the region of Jerusalem and Judea. And similarly, there were lots of debates about what the name was. Originally de Saulcy said it said king, but that's because he had bad Hebrew and Aramaic. But then eventually thought, well, maybe it's Sarah, the queen, because the Daled and the Resh look very similar. One hypothesis is that Sada might have been Helena's like Mesopotamian or Aramaic name. Another suggestion by a colleague of mine, Amit Gvaryahu, who kindly came to the site with me and helped me try to understand it, was that it's actually like a title, like the equivalent of like a venerable queen or something like that, rather than the name of an individual. But also the archaeological consensus is that it's not necessarily Helena's tomb, but rather, Helena's sarcophagus. It could also have been any other royal woman figure from that family. Or, yeah, maybe I'll stop there because I could talk about that debate for a long time. But one of the identifiers of the tomb as Helen's tomb is based on its location in relation to how Josephus describes it. And the other is the architectural features and the inscription and things like that. And so one of the things that I don't want to argue necessarily is that this must be Helen's tomb. Rather, I'm really interested in how people came to think of it as Helen's tomb. And in that story, this sarcophagus plays a really important role.
So I think we should I want to get to your conclusion and then we'll have time for a few more questions at the end. But please keep going, enlightening us, because this and she is fascinating.
Great. So let me screen share one last time. So I've sketched in broad strokes, at least, the history of this tomb from the 14th through the 20th century. And in the last few minutes, I want to reflect on some of the implications of this history and the way that I've chosen to tell it. Some recent accounts of the tomb in the modern period begin with de Saulcy's trip to the region in 1850 and his return to conduct an archaeological excavation of the site in 1863. This is a convenient place to begin, not least because of de Saulcy's salaciously captivating accounts of his expeditions, in which he details his discovery of a sarcophagus deep inside one of the tomb's burial niches. De Saulcy long insisted, contrary to an abundance of evidence, that the tomb housed remains of Davidic kings and queens. Narratives that begin the story of the tomb in 1850 suggest that de Saulcy's misconceptions about the tomb of the kings were common in his day. Starting the narrative long before de Saulcy's trip to Jerusalem changes this story. Sources from decades before de Saulcy's excavations confirm that others had already assumed or convincingly argued in public and in print that the tomb dated not to the biblical era, but to the Greco-Roman period, and that it might well have belonged to Queen Helena of Adiabene. With this longer historical view, we learn that de Saulcy did not make a discovery that eventually led to the re-identification of Helena's tomb. Rather, he deliberately argued against such an identification because it complicated his effort to map the Bible into the city's topography and harmed his ambition to discover one of the most important biblical monuments, the tomb of Judean kings and their wives, in the city's landscape. It wasn't until de Saulcy insisted that the tomb could not possibly have been built by Helena and that it unquestionably dates to the biblical period that its identification with Helena needed to be forcefully asserted by archaeologists and historians. Examining sources that predate de Saulcy highlight, in contrast, that memory of Helena's tomb never fully disappeared. It was an ancient tradition that persisted through medieval and modern times, even as other traditions about the tomb developed alongside it. Yet despite the fact that archaeological consensus generally accepts that the tomb dates to the late Second Temple period and most likely belonged to Helena, the monument continues to be called the Tomb of the Kings. De Saulcy was not the only one who stood to benefit from the tomb's association with the biblical past, however historically erroneous such a claim was. that a Frenchman had discovered an important biblical tomb on behalf of the French government also served national interest, especially at a time when the ancient past, and Jerusalem's biblical past in particular, played such a central role in the development of ancient ambitions and international relations. De Saulcy's excavation had the potential to put France on a level playing field with England and Germany in their race to establish presence not only in present-day Jerusalem, but also in the city's ancient history and its subterranean treasures. In 1879, when Christophe Edward Maus cleared the site, he noted that it had become, quote, like an annex to our Louvre Museum on the very grounds of Palestine. Because the tomb's vessels, coins, lamps, figurines, doors, and sarcophagi had been brought to Paris and were by then displayed at the Louvre, de Saulcy had also managed to bring Jerusalem to Paris. As a remnant from antiquity, rather than simply an architectural marvel, it gained still greater attention and respect. In 1912, the Jewish historian Joseph Klausner unequivocally identified the tomb as, quote, the most important remnant other than the Western Wall that endures for the Jewish people from the Second Temple period. On the eve of the Great War, Helena's tomb was now a part of Jerusalem, had reached a status second only to the Jews' holiest and most historic site in Jerusalem. Tracing the tomb's long history also reveals the tomb's transformation from an archaeological curiosity outside the city to a central destination within it, as the city of Jerusalem grew and as Jerusalem became more important within the Ottoman Empire. And if you have a look at this map, you see in the circle that the Tomb of the Kings, Tomb des Rois, is really outside of what was considered the city of Jerusalem. The early 1860s, and here is another example of that, where you see the Tomb of the Kings really at the edge of what's considered Jerusalem. The early 1860s saw Jerusalem's urban expansion to neighborhoods beyond the city's Ottoman walls. Only 3 years before de Saulcy's excavation, Mishkenot Sha'ananim, the first housing project built outside the Old City, funded by Moses Montefiore, was completed. That neighborhood, which was slow to attract residents, became the first of many in what soon became a fast-growing new city. 2 years after de Saulcy's excavation, construction began for the first residential buildings in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, initiated by Rabbi el-Husseini. The Nashashibis, another prominent Jerusalemite family, soon built homes in that new neighborhood as well. Eventually, the American colony relocated to this area too. Helena's tomb is situated in the heart of this neighborhood. The story of how this overgrown tomb, beyond the outskirts of the city, became a must-see attraction within the city, as you see here, overlaps with the story of how Jerusalem itself transformed in the same period from a relatively small city in the periphery of the Ottoman Empire to an important urban center to which travelers of all sorts flocked from all over the world. In 1863, the same year in which de Saulcy excavated the tomb, the Ottoman Empire made Jerusalem into the first municipality in Palestine. This elevated the status of the city within the empire. This urban and imperial context is key to understanding how the tomb itself grew in importance. Helena's tomb became once again the first and last place that travelers and pilgrims to the city visited, and emblematic of the city itself and of its ancient, if mysterious, past. What happened to the tomb after de Saulcy's excavation, local reactions to it, the sale of the tomb, and the series of controversies surrounding its ownership in the later decades of the 19th century, as well as what we can glean about how residents and visitors interacted with the tomb for the century and a half after de Saulcy's excavation, is similarly important for understanding its significance in the city's long history. In the modern story about her tomb, Helena's memory stands at the center of controversy and negotiations about identity, the identity of the landscape and the city, and of people's attachment to that land and its history. Debates about the tomb and the identity of those buried inside were about more than whether the tomb belonged to a certain king or queen or a dynasty of one era or another. They were about verifying religious belief, discovering a lost biblical past, and writing one's story into that past, exerting international influence, and owning the land and its history. These debates were both matters of local and personal interest, and also national and international affairs. So I'm going to end my formal presentation here and look forward to your questions and reflections on the material that I've just shared.
Thank you so much. I'm thinking about this kind of question of transmission, and we live in this moment in which, you know, you can have deep fakes and pictures can be faked and things and context can be changed. And it's amazing how even that history, you know, with even the duel, the Tomb of the Kings, the Helena's tomb kind of exists until you start getting this photographic record where it just keeps going as the Tomb of the Kings, which I find to be kind of this remarkable shift to say, oh, look, I can invent the context that I need. So what we're experiencing in this moment, as always, there's nothing new under the stars. And there are a couple of kind of questions I wanted to get back to. One of them is, someone wanted to know if Queen Helena influenced the Khuzari at all. And where does she come in that space?
Thank you so much. So I think you're really right to point to the moment in which we are currently living, where sort of the veracity of images is forefront in our mind, right? Are the people that we hear saying particular words actually the ones saying them, or is it an AI generator? And the same is true for images and written words and so on. And the truth is that you're right. I think that there's nothing new under the sun. And of course, you need photography you need the sun for photography, because the rhetoric of photography in the 19th century was that it is finally capturing reality. And yet actually photography doesn't capture reality in the same way that paintings and engravings and drawings don't, because you're framing the image in a particular way. So if you were to construct a story of Jerusalem based on Auguste Salzmann's images, Jerusalem would be a fully abandoned city, full of ancient ruins and sort of weeds coming out of it. And in fact, it was a bustling city with lots of different people who lived there, but that wasn't what interested Salzmann. And it also wasn't what was easy for the technology of his day to produce, because in order to put images of people, or to include people in your photographs, those people have to stand very still for a really long amount of time. And the exposure, the time of exposure is annoying if you actually aren't interested in the people. And actually, scholars of the history of photography point out that Salzmann was trained in photography in the Alsatian towns from which he came, and there also sort of the style of photography was photographing these like buildings standing alone, and so on. So I think being as critical of photographs before AI or Photoshop, we learn something when we think about how images are produced. In terms of the Khazars, so that's a wonderful question that is maybe most exciting to answer in the context of Rehov Heleni Hamalka, the street named after this queen in Jerusalem. That street was created in the late Ottoman period, didn't originally have a name, as early streets didn't at the time. And it acquired a name, it seems, first when the Pro-Jerusalem Society in the early 1920s under the British formed a group to both solidify names of streets that already existed and to give names to streets that didn't have any names. And the name that they gave that street was Queen Melissane's Way, in memory of the Crusader Queen of Jerusalem, another fascinating figure for those interested in women in Jerusalem. And in 1948, in November, while the war was still raging in Jerusalem, but parts of Jerusalem already came under Israeli control, there was a committee that met. It was called Vadat Shmot HaRechovot BeYerushalayim, the Committee on the Street Names in Jerusalem. A group of people sat to decide which street names to keep and which to change. And it was in the fourth meeting of that, the fourth session of those meetings when they decided that they wanted to change this street name. And originally they proposed that the street should be called Shlomit or Shulamit, which eventually actually became the street now known as Shlom Tzion. But that they had already given to Princess Mary Street, which is now Shlom Tzion. And so Yitzhak Ben Tzvi decided, well, why don't we call the street Hamalka Helena? And he explains, like, she wasn't Jewish, but she was good for Jerusalem, something along those lines. Or no, sorry, she was Greek, but she was good for Jerusalem. Maybe a random choice, but for those who are familiar with Ben Tzvi's academic interests and his publications, Ben Tzvi was very interested in the history of Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, and in all of the places where there were small but old Jewish communities, among them Jews from Georgia and the Caucasus and so on. And in his book, Nitrei Yisrael, Queen Helen forms a really important part of that story, because any time that he needed to explain how a certain group of people became Jews, if he couldn't rely on the Khazars because they were Jews before the Khazars, he says Queen Helena was the reason why those people became Jewish. And so she becomes sort of the pre-Khazar queen that you can explain sort of Judaism in sort of all four corners of the world. And so that connection to the Khazars is actually a really perceptive question.
Oh, that's amazing. And also, again, in the spirit of Women's History Month and International Women's Day, the fact that, you know, this pillar of being someone who's converting is a woman figure is really remarkable. Is there any sense of who the other people who are buried in the tomb are or were? Clearly, they're no longer with us.
So it's interesting. This might not be the answer that you're looking for, but who was buried originally in the tomb in these underground chambers, at least as far as I know, is really hard to tell because we don't have access to those bones or sarcophagi really anymore. Even the study of the bones that were discovered has an interesting history, but one of Dissel-C argued that there were some bones that had been burnt and some bones that had not been burnt. And so on that level, it seems as though many of the bones, both of Titus's army and of the Jews during the time of the revolt, ended up being deposited in this large courtyard. That's one sort of opinion that dates back to some of this material. And then also there were other sarcophagi and remains that were deposited in the centuries after. So it wasn't a site that existed and then was sealed shut like in Pompeii and it's a time capsule. It's really like accumulates later remains. So we have Byzantine lamps that were discovered in the courtyard, coins from later periods, and so on. And so some of the people who were sort of included in this site were later people who died. Whether the tomb housed Helena and her son, or maybe also other descendants of the family or associates, is entirely possible, but we don't. I at least don't have much evidence to sort of answer that definitively.
I think that's also because I think we do have this picture of archaeological sites being, this is a moment in time, it's sealed, no one knows, you know, the discovery of it is the big piece, but this was always there. It's just that you have this guy who then implants his own history on top of it. I did note it was interesting that in the British map from 1875, it still had in parentheses the tomb of Helena, so that even the Brits, even in that moment, were like, we're not taking this Frenchman's advice on this. I want to thank you so much for sharing this research. When or should we expect this really fascinating book to be released?
I would say another 2 years.
Okay. So
And so
probably
at least I hope that you can hold it in your hands soon.
I have a feeling that a lot of people on this talk are like, wait, I'd like to put that in my calendar. So 2 years from now, guys, we'll poke at Dr. Kattan Gribetz again to see how it's going. Thank you. And again, as Tani said, we are really delighted to be able to share research in this process, and just for you to be able to assemble all of the different directions in which, you know, but from the maps to the archival pieces to the photographs themselves. Thank you so much for showing your work and giving us an insight to how this kind of history is constructed. We'll be back again next week, as Julia will be back specifically. So join us again next week. We are going to be starting an exploration of a different queen, Esther. And Dr. Aaron Kohler, who's taught for us a few times before, is going to be looking at Mordecai the Jew and Esther the Greek, the changing politics of the Book of Esther in antiquity and our times. So, and the week after that, we have Dr. Shira Billet with us doing Law as a Moral Force, when President Truman and Chief Justice Warren studied Talmud at JTS. I cannot wait for either of these. I think they're going to be, for both of these, I think they're going to be great. And thank you all so much for joining us. And again, thank you for sharing your research.
Thank you so much.